So we get to America, right? And we're gonna tread softly here, but a couple things that I think are happening in the narrative as it's being presented in America that bothers me is we pretend as if slavery. Maybe we don't say it and maybe we don't believe it, but we act like it in our conversations, that it all began with America, right? The slave trade from Africa, like Americans rode over to Africa and set that up just to send them back and ship them over to America to do all this stuff. And so we have this kind of narrative that it was all America's fault. America is a no good, awful, terrible place built upon the backs of slavery. The Indians were peaceful people. We robbed their lands. We stole their lands. They were peaceful. And then we brought slaves in from Africa to build this nation. And here we are. What a wicked, wicked nation we are. Like, that is the broad narrative that's being presented, right? And that is the broad narrative that we push back against, because in the same way that you have to understand the biblical context, you have to understand the context of the formation of this country. Slavery was still all through the world. There was not a nation that did not use slavery at that time that I know of, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong out there. I mean, you can go for it if you want to. But one thing America is unique to, and I think this is important, it's unique to getting rid of slavery. Right? It is unique in that way of leading the charge to banish slavery throughout the modern world. And people might push back against that, but just go look at history. Like, we were unique. Now, why were we unique? That's another question. Why were we unique? Were we just better people than everybody else? No, we weren't. We've already established that. We all struggle. We all have sins. We all, we're in this corporate. Humanity is in this corporate issue of sin. We were unique because we had a constitution, because we had a law, the same way that Israel had a law, right? They had the 10 Commandments. We were unique in the sense that we had a law that said all men are created equal in the eyes of God. We had that law. Now, did we always follow through with that law? No. Are we guiltless? No, we're not guiltless. But that law shows us that the men that started this country understood that Imago Dei. They understood at least what Genesis 1 and 2 was saying about man. They at least understood it. Now, again, God had to work on their hearts, right? God had to take them on this journey. And in some ways, the black community suffered because of this journey that God was working through these men on. But you look at certain men like John Adams, he never had this struggle. He hated it from the beginning, right? It's not as if all Americans were on the board of slavery as these Africans started being brought into the country. But I think it is important to recognize those two things, that it was not unique to America. The whole world was doing slavery still at this time. But it is unique to America in our motivation and our desire to come out of slavery. And it is unique to us because of our starting point. Our starting point is what encouraged us to move forward out of slavery, to stop owning people. And our starting point was the Imago Dei. That was the starting point, that all men are equal in the eyes of God.
We, what we've been talking about, what we often, especially what's brought out in this subject in the last couple of weeks, is just if we view history and reality too simply in black and white terms, we're just bound to miss it. And we can't really get at the truth if we try to reduce it down into something overly simplified.
Yeah, amen.
And so that's what happens big time when people start examining or buy into a certain narrative about history and about U.S. history especially. And I've been guilty of this because we're longing to understand what's going on in the world. And so then we have these different points of view that are presented to us. And what happens for a lot of us, I think we felt like the experience maybe as we were kids, and we had people maybe our families, maybe the schools, that in one form or another tries to indoctrinate us with an overly simplified positive view of America, where all the founding fathers were the most benevolent men, and they were all doing good, and they came over on the Mayflower and they had a big Thanksgiving picnic with the Native Americans, and all was swell, and we just gloss over slavery. Yeah, that didn't happen, and people see some of that and they're like, wait a minute, no,
that's not real.
Yeah,
that's.
But then we recognize there was more to it than that, so we're suspicious of that picture of history. Yeah. We rightly should be.
Sure.
It's a rose-colored glasses there. And maybe some people, out of fear in some way, choose to, or the inability, because, hey, we're talking about our need to engage in this conversation, but it's difficult.
But that's how man tells history, right? Man only tells history from a positive light. They don't want to look at their negativities. And the reason I say that is go back to the Old Testament. All these people are talking about slavery in the Bible. The Bible is littered with things that God's people did that was wrong, right?
Unflattering
things. And so I'm just saying that to say, obviously there was a larger designer and artist to this book, right?
Yeah,
because they would have told, the nation of Israel would have told history the same way that you're talking about Americans tell history in our classrooms today. They would have glossed over, they would have probably said, yeah, we didn't do any of that slavery stuff, or we didn't, we were perfect. Moses, man, he was always doing right. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, just top-notch guys.
Well, and that's what we would say, that there's an apologetic point to be made about the authenticity of the Bible.
Yes.
That's what you're saying, is that if humans wrote the story, if Israelites wrote, if they were responsible for writing their own history, and just from a humanistic perspective, it would be much more favorable toward them. But if you read the Old Testament, it is not a pretty picture for Israel. They do not come out looking good.
Not at all.
So, God, though, communicates history, maybe not in exhaustive detail in the Bible, but communicates a reality.
Yeah.
And what people want and need is reality. So people have hungered for an accurate history of America. And so we start filling in the blanks, or we know that, hey, there's more to it, and you're not talking about this. And this part was ugly, and it was nasty, and we need to address it because we have grievances toward it. But people then, because they've been suspicious, rightly, of this form of history, they start painting their own picture. And it is inherently kind of defensive or a pushback against this rose-colored picture of history, and it's all swings the other way, and it's like just pointing the finger at, no, actually you're not always the good guy. You've done this and this and this and this and this, and before you know it, we've got a picture of history that's all the negative stuff that we've ever done. And then that's how, and I would say there's been a trend in a recent generation, in the last several decades, of pushing this picture of history. And I'd say that it's one thing to approach these things honestly and have a rounded out view of history. But because of the sinful nature, the selfish nature of humans, and the way in which we view things from our limited perspectives and with our own agendas, we've taken this form of history and pushed an agenda with it. And in the process, we've neglected to tell the good side of America because we need people to see the bad side.
And when we say agenda, we're not necessarily saying the people that are in the causes. We're saying the people above the people that are in the causes. There's actually genuine people out there at these protests. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying there's not genuine people with real feelings
and real criticisms
and
of U.S. history.
That's right.
Or that people that I would disagree with, Howard Zinn or Noam Chomsky, or somebody whose worldview is very highly critical of America, they make valid points along the way. People who point out the ugly part of American history, those are valid truths, but what conclusions do you come to? How are you then characterizing the nature of things, and what are you suggesting we do about it moving forward?
But I could take a Howard Zinn, or I could take any individual that's listening to this, and I could say, I bet you I could take you, set you in an auditorium in a chair, and I could look at your life if I had a list of everything that you've done, and if I listed all the bad things that you've done, all the wicked things that you've done, and I ignored all the good things that you've done, you would sit in that chair and you would squirm and you would be angry because you'd be going, that's not fair. Because there's another side to me. That's not the context of that. I did that, but you need to know this. Yes, I did that when I was 14, but I've grown so much, and now I'm 30, and I would never do that now. And I'm like, can we not see that? Like, is anybody looking like that? Like, we are a nation of individuals, and a nation is a child, and it has growth in it, right? And if you look at the growth curve of America in all this that's going on today has an argument in the same way that individual would if I was sitting here criticizing them for the things that they did when they were 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, and now they're 50, and they're like, well, that's stupid. That's absurd. Like, I was 16 when I did that. Like, I'm a grown-up. I'm mature now. And it's like to pretend as if, now, to also pretend that at 50 you're completely mature is also absurd. You're not. You still have years to go. Right? But that's the problem I see, is that we can't look at this. And I know that we just said you can't, it's not oversimplified, but there is a way to simplify in like a situation like that to at least go, this is a nation of people, of individuals, and an individual would be very angry if you did that to them, because that's not fair. That's not a true light. It's not a true representation of who they are, who they were, and who they're trying to become. But that's what we're doing to America right now. We're sitting her in a chair and we're listing all these things out that are horrible, nasty, terrible about her. And we're not being honest about her.
Nor honest and hopeful. I mean, underneath the angst and the frustration of people is a desire for a better world.
Which is a good desire.
Yeah, they want a better life for themselves. But yet we're conducting ourselves in such a way that won't allow the growth that needs to happen among us all to get to that place. But instead, if we characterize an individual or a nation and you put, what we're saying is you've always been this way, and so you're always going to be this way.
Right.
And that's always characterized who you've been at the core. So that's going to always characterize who you are going to be. And so we need to get rid of you now, because we must forcefully put an end to this thing that's we've been held captive by these 200 years or so. And what all we're saying is, hey, no, step back and realize in this overarching narrative of history where the United States comes on the scene is actually in its founding principles, and it's made up of a multitude of people. You got to think, I mean, if people are coming here, settling in these early colonies, there's all kinds of worldviews, there's all kinds of economic systems. There's not, I mean, you're in a wilderness, and you can't.
There's a lot of tribes that need a law, right? I mean, it's not much different.
And along the way, these men who see the need,
a unifying law,
because what's happening is whoever's most powerful is becoming most dominant. In the early we were British colonies, and so this economic model that comes from Europe is being planted into the United States and built upon. And in certain ways, some parts of it are employing the slave model. And so that's being built up and established, but you also have others who don't agree with that model.
Mm-hmm.
You have people that view the world differently, and maybe some of them had slaves even because they're conflicted. They're in the middle of it. That's the world that they were born into. That's the world that they understand and know. But along the way,
Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, perhaps they come to wrestle with these things and eventually reject them as an individual. But you got a whole nation of individuals. You also have powerful economic forces and other forces that are at work. And so by the time we get to the late 1800s and a civil war, I mean, it's complex, and we can't even get into that here, but it's worth exploring the complexity of the various forces that are at work, the economic forces, the religious, moral forces that are at play.
Yep.
And man, these things are fighting a battle, and it can't just be resolved in a snap. But we see a civil war being played out, but even in that, in Lincoln's decision, he considered the preservation of the Union even more important than in that moment ending slavery, simply pragmatically, because if the Union loses, then slavery is going to be perpetuated,
right?
Because that's the model that they're warring against. So it's more important in the moment to keep the Union together, to resist the outside influences and forces that want to destroy the United States and implement the slave model worldwide.
We could talk about this right now in our present day of what's going on.
But we see in it that there's these forces, these ideologies that are above it, that are driving the things on the ground and how things are playing out. And it's, on the one hand, it's more complicated, but on the other hand, it can be simplified and reduced to prevailing worldviews, prevailing moralities.
And you see this struggle in the very sense of when slavery was ended, it wasn't fully ended. Like, you still had Jim Crow, you still had all that, right? I mean, like, just because you say something in law, this is ended, it doesn't mean the mindset changes the next day. Oh, okay, well, they made it a law. Let's start treating people equal. That's not how that works, right? Like, that's not how the human mind works.
Because there's a sin problem.
There's a sin problem.
To cut to the chase.
Exactly.
And people today want to institute some radical change to society and the structures and the laws, and expecting you can just legislate all the evil away in the world and the condition of people's hearts. But we need to address the heart condition that affects us all. Some people might carry it out in slavery, or how they treat another human being, in racism or something like that. Somebody else might carry it out in how they treat a woman, or how they understand their sexuality, or whatever it might be.
And so what I want to say is we move towards, how does this become reconciled? I think the first thing that people right now in this present day need to ask is this. I think it was Spurgeon, I could be wrong, somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, who said, when you see a fence, before you remove it, you need to ask, why was it put there to begin with? If you see a fence, before you remove it, you need to ask, why was it put there to begin with? And to me, that is a beautiful quote for our day. If we see a constitution, if we see these things that we have put into place, we need to ask, why were they put there? Because if you remove it, something has to fill the void. Seattle. If you remove it, what kind of world are you asking for? Right? We see this through the Old Testament. God told Adam and Eve, if you do this, you don't understand the world that you're asking for. You don't understand the death and destruction that's about to follow if you start to play God and eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? You don't understand. Israel, if you go into the promised land and you start to live like the surrounding nations and do not honor the Lord thy God, you are going to lead yourself to being exiled from the promised land. You don't understand what you're asking for if you decide to rebel against me after I give you the land. America, if you continue down this path You do not understand what you are asking for, but you ought to look at Seattle and get a little glimpse of what you're asking for. Are we perfect? No, we are not. But is the curve moving upward? Yes, it is. It has always been moving upward. It has always been moving to a brighter and better future. But there is a group of people that desire for America not to be a brighter and better future. They desire us not to be a city on a hill, a light in the darkness. They desire to destroy us because that is what America has been. And the reason America has been that in the world is because it was founded upon Genesis. It was founded upon the Imago Dei. And that is why we have been what we've been. And if you take the Imago Dei out of it, if you take Genesis out of the Constitution, reality out of the Constitution, you have to put something in there for that. Is it going to be Darwinian evolution by natural selection? Then don't argue when people start killing people in the streets, because it's the strongest survive, buddy. So you better arm up and you better get ready and you better be strong, because that is the new way to live. That is the new way to treat each other. So quit complaining about injustices, because they're about to get rampant. You're just a bunch of animals, and therefore we need to act as animals act.
And when Israel was going into the promised land, and they saw in the surrounding nations that they had kings, and they wanted a king like those countries. And God said, I'm your king. You don't need a king from men. God is your king. And that was supposed to be the case from the beginning. God is our ultimate rule and authority, and we are subservient under him. But God gave them what they asked for. And he said, when I give you this, just be warned, he's going to rule over you harshly.
He's going to
cruelly.
take your lands.
And it's going to ruin everything that I'm providing for you. So we see just the point that you've made is that we don't want God's rule. We want to do it our way, and we think that we know better. But God has given us a king, a rule, and he's made us a nation under him. And that's for all of humanity under Christ. And whatever might be true and good and the best of the United States and our values and our history and legacy and our hope for the future and what we can build on, it is in line with those things from God, the things that God has given us, a foundation there. And whether we've realized it or not along the way, whether the founders, whether they were Christians or had some sort of biblical worldview, or it was just a strong morality shaped by the Christian world that they existed in, they understand that those principles have to be the foundation. And if we want to remove that, then yeah, we're going to be in trouble. But by the grace of God, we are moving in that direction, and our only hope to keep moving that direction is to look to God and to recognize that God is our one true King, that he is ruling now, that he is over these things. And while it's hard and it's ugly along the way, that's our fault. But God is with us to help us endure. And thankfully, God, through Jesus, was available for those in slavery in America. And you see the profound impact of Christianity for the American slave, but the black community, and how their faith was so strong. And it is tragic that people would see Christianity as a white man's religion and another form of slavery. And man, that's an important part of this conversation, but maybe it's for another conversation. But that's
pretty sure Abraham wasn't white. Nor Jesus.
The tragedy. Yeah, I mean, that only comes from people who don't really understand it, don't know the Bible, don't see the history for what it is. But that's kind of what I'm getting at, is the very things that by God's grace have come about in the best of humanity, and they're the vehicles in which God is using to carry us forward. There, like you said, there are those who want to tear it down, who don't want us to go that way. And we just need to recognize, though this is an imperfect vessel that God is moving us through, that's how God works. Yeah. And let's all get on board more, and the more that we do in humility, recognizing our ugly past, recognizing our current reality of sinfulness, but let's humbly, graciously, work through these things together to try to get to that better place, upholding our institutions that maintain order, regulate society,
that have been proven to give us a foundation to move forward.
And
I don't care about the
best
founding
opportunity.
Fathers. Yeah, I think people try to lure me into this conversation all the time. I don't care if the founding fathers were Christians or not. There were kings in Israel days that adopted the laws and regulations of Israel because they saw that they worked. They saw that they represented a reality, and that's what they do. That's what these things do. They represent a reality, right? And whether the founding fathers were Christians or not, they instituted reality, right, on laws of God's order that we could live by and that we could move forward by as a nation.
So our prayer is that we'll keep carrying on.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure this conversation will continue. In the comments alone, we'll probably have much to talk about.
So much to say, but that's what we hope. It can be an ongoing thing that we work through together.